That's a good one.
Like that?
Yeah, crawl spaces, boy. Nobody wants to talk about crawl spaces in their homes. We all know we have them. For the most part, I'd say about 90% of the homes here in Washington State have crawl spaces on this side of the mountains, on the west side. So we deal a lot with crawl spaces, and again, people are afraid of the crawl space, okay, because they don't know what's down there. It's dark, it's sometimes dirty. Well, most times it's dirty. But we typically don't have an understanding of what the value is of the crawl space and actually what its function is for the house. So I want to cover some areas. I want to cover what happens in a crawl space. We're going to talk about the insulation, the ventilation, rodents, pests, things of that nature in crawl spaces. But early on, we talked about airflow in a house, and I had mentioned that WSU had did a study on 10 different houses over 3 years, and we wanted to measure where our indoor air quality came from. And through that study, again, the results were that over 40% of our makeup air, that's air that comes into the house when we push air out of the house, is known to be coming from the crawl spaces. So it's very important to understand that the crawl space has a function, and that within that function, we actually want to make sure that that air is what it's supposed to be and not harmful to it. So, crawl spaces. The first thing that I want to address with the crawl space when I talk about the ventilation with the crawl space and its aspect of how it affects 40% of our makeup air. There's a theory that's known as what we call the stack effect that happens within buildings and structures. And to make it very simplistic, the stack effect is actually negative and positive air pressure planes that work within a house. And so if I were to say to a consumer or potential homeowner, if you envision that house actually looking like it were an hourglass, where it's kind of big at the bottom, skinny in the middle, and big at the top, we refer to that as the stack effect. And what's at the base, this is what we call negative pressure. Everything's trying to get in this way. Now again, as we all know, hot air rises, okay? So as air rises, it's going to be pulling in other air from it. So within the crawl space, this is the negative pressure zone. At some place in the structure, it becomes neutral. At the top of the house and within the attic, it becomes positive. Now all that air is trying to push out of the house, okay? So it's very important to understand that theory and that concept of the stack effect and how that's affecting air moving into the house. So people seem to think a lot of times that a crawl space, again, out of sight, out of mind, things are in there, we should just kind of like button it up and never think anything about it. And so one part of a crawl space's critical function is a lot of times where we build here, it's an area in which all the plumbing and the mechanical systems or heat vents and all those types of things are within the crawl space, just so for the convenience of construction. Well, within there also on the outside of a house, a lot of times we'll see those vents on the outside of the house. And the purpose of those vents is actually allow air to flow into the crawl space. It may seem kind of, although oxymoronic, that I make the statement that 40% of our air comes from the crawl space and we're dealing with the stack effect and how air is moving up. Why wouldn't we want to cover up all the vents in the crawl space and not let any air whatsoever breathe in there? The reason is we do want air moving in the crawl space. So as we have good clean air moving in the crawl space, and if it's coming from the exteriors, it is good clean air for the most part. Okay, so we want to keep those vents open. Now, the vents in and of by themselves, we want to be mindful of those, that as you're looking at a house, whether to purchase a home or you already own the home, if any of those vents get a rip or a tear in them, even something that you may think is very minimal, the size of a dime or a quarter, believe me, if a rodent can get his head into something, his body will theoretically flatten out and it'll follow him into those areas. And so therefore, it prevents any rodent intrusions into the crawl space. So it's important to keep the crawl space tight, okay? Meaning tight, but also has to have airflow. Now, things that are within the crawl space, one thing, we're going to talk about the airflow in just a moment, so bear with me. But one thing that we want to address is the plastic that's on the ground inside of the crawl space. Many times over, people have said, why is the plastic black? And why do we even have the plastic in there? So understanding air and temperature of air and things like that, if you looked at the ground level being one temperature and the air above it being another, and then you have another surface above that, which is i.e. our house, so the ground temperature being less, therefore moisture could come out of the ground. Okay? So one thing, we want to keep that moisture in the ground so it doesn't have an opportunity through convective currents and the stack effect actually to move up and through the house. So the principle of the plastic, first off, is to keep the moisture in the ground. The second principle is the black plastic. Black prohibits any light from getting through it. We've seen clear plastic in crawl spaces before, but it's irregardless of the color of the plastic that the effect of condensation occurs underneath of the plastic. Although if you envision the clear plastic almost acting as a magnifying glass, and you had, like when we were a kid, little magnifying glasses, right? And so as the clear goes, if you had any moisture underneath of that clear plastic and any type of heat, whether through visual, like through solar and or infrared heat that got into the crawl space, and that plastic acting as a magnifier and the ground being moist, we're going to produce mold. So therefore, the black plastic prohibits any light from getting through it. Therefore, the chances are minimalized for any type of mold or bacteria types of issues that are being produced by, again, the air in the crawl space. So now we've got air flowing over a good clean sea of black plastic. All of our vents are nice and neat and tied up so we don't have any rodent intrusions. That also is very, very, very important for houses that have access to their crawl spaces from the exteriors of their homes. We really, really, really need to make particular attention to how we seal up that entrance so that we don't allow for rodents to get in there as well. So sometimes what that's meaning nowadays, we're actually building a frame, like a pressure-treated 2x4 frame with some good heavy screening on that so the rodents can't get through that, so it fills a nice tight area around the opening to the crawl space. So if your crawl space is on the the exterior of the house, we want to make sure that's nice and sealed up. So now we've addressed the air that's moving into the crawl space, the plastic that's on the ground. So now let's address the floor joist. When we deal with the floor joist, which is the structural member of the house we're actually walking on, when we insulate a crawl space, we want to insulate actually from the bottom of that floor joist right up to and touching the bottom of the subfloor that we stand on top of. The reason is because we want air flowing down here. Insulation, R, the R value stands for resistance. So the thicker and deeper that insulation is, the more resistance. It's like 1,000 million little air pockets trying to diffuse air from either getting into a structure or getting out of a structure. Cold air, warm air, vice versa, trying to get in and or out. So it's very important that the way that the insulation is put into the floor joist. The ways that we don't want to see insulation put into a floor joist. Do not like to see the pieces of metal that we stuff up in there and then the insulation looks like a big snake that's going through there, right? And all these Humpty Dumptys in there. Those are called thermal breaks. So anywhere that you have the insulation not touching the floor, that's a break. In other words, a thermal break, air could pass over the top of that and infiltrate into the house. If the insulation isn't fully touching the bottom of the subfloor, if it's fallen down and there's a gap over the top of the insulation, in theory, it's actually like you don't even have any insulation in your crawl space. The air is going right over the top of it and passing and going right into the house. So the ideal area and means in which to insulate a crawl space basically is for insulated from, again, the bottom of the subfloor joist, the floor joist itself, right up to and touching the bottom of the subfloor. It's very important also to understand with insulation, if you compress insulation, it loses all of its R value. R is resistance. If you compress the resistance, you basically eliminate any value that it had for the resistance being such to keep the air in the crawl space. So again, the crawl space, the black 6 mil poly, the insulation of the subfloors, etc. The insulation of the water lines are very important in a crawl space as well, although for our benefit here, we don't get extremely cold, so we have very few or minimal issues as far as freezing in crawl spaces go. But if you do those things, you're going to help basically increase the air quality to your house.